So, I think everybody has pretty much taken their seats now. We are enormously privileged to have Yadvinder Malhi for giving our Stamford Raffles Lecture this time. Yadvinder, who now has an office about 500 or 600 meters from me, because I now have moved to Oxford, having betrayed Imperial College, where I was for 25 years. I've been in Oxford for 2. But Yadvinder is down the road. He's Professor of Ecosystem Science at the University of Oxford. And basically, he's going to be talking to us this evening on a title, which you can read. One of the odd things about government I discovered was that most presentations by civil servants assumes you can't read, so they would read the bullet points to you. And after about the third week of doing that, I started to get irritable and very unpopular and saying, you know, your audience can read, so I'm not going to read your title, Yadvinder, you'll be pleased to know. But Yadvinder's research focuses on understanding ecosystem ecology, particularly in tropical ecosystems, and his specialization in tropical forests, initially in South America, but subsequently elsewhere in the world, gives a real feeling for how we actually deal with what are enormous problems. I really feel that we have got, that with people like Yadvinder and his colleagues and others who've actually been honored today, we have a chance of turning zoological science and ecology into something that is akin to an engineering science. It can produce tools to help us solve problems. And that is so essential in a world where we have very difficult problems, probably the worst problems that a generation has faced in the first 2 or 3 decades of the 21st century. So it's with a complete delight I now hand over to Yadvinder, who's going to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is the microphone functioning fine? That's great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And it's a great honor to be here. And I was invited a few months ago to come and give this talk. And I found it quite an intriguing challenge because I stand before you here in the Zoological Society of London as a vegetation ecosystem ecologist. I spent my entire life trying to understand how vegetation formations and the functioning of ecosystems is driven by the cycling of carbon and nutrient and water through vegetation-dominated systems. And the sorts of questions that I've often looked at, looking at an image like this, this is a Lope National Park in Gabon. It's a beautiful mosaic of forest expanding out from hilltops and savanna, and asking questions like, why is the vegetation in this pattern? Why are the trees found where they are? Why are the grasses found where they are? And what is the flow of energy or nutrients or water through this system? And if at a global level, I can ask similar questions. Looking at images of the Earth from space, we see this pattern such as this. And what we see in these images, where we see signs of life, are signs of vegetated life. So it appears that we live on a planet of plants in terms of this global picture. And broadly, from our school-level education, we know where these patterns emerge from. The rising convection at the equator causes heavy rainfall, and you have the rainforest, the air subsides over the deserts, and you have suppression of rain, you have rain belt at higher latitudes. So broadly, we understand that abiotic processes, the climate, shapes the nature of ecosystems, the distribution of ecosystems on Earth. And in this broad picture, which is also the picture that prevails in our global ecosystem models that try and simulate the functioning of the planet and how it's changing under anthropogenic domination, we tend to think of the interactions between the abiotic world and the biotic vegetated world. And so that we have these sorts of understandings of processes, whether the exchange of trace gases, the exchange of energy or water between the atmosphere and the land and the oceans. And if you look closely, you can see that animal life is implicit in there in some of those processes, in the soil-biosphere interaction, in the biogeochemistry of the oceans. There may be some there, but it's not very explicit in there. And what I'm going to explore in this lecture is part of an increasing realization within the ecosystem ecology community, and perhaps in my own awareness of the important role that various animals play in the functioning of the basic functioning of the biogeochemistry and ecosystem ecology of the planet. And but when we first started looking at why different vegetation patterns were found in different parts of the world, one of the key pioneering thinkers was the pioneering ecologist Robert Whittaker. And in the 70s, he came up with this textbook example of trying to look at vegetation patterns and plot them against two basic climate variables, temperature and precipitation. And where things were very wet, you had, if they were warm and wet, you had tropical rainforests. A bit cooler, you had temperate rainforests, some seasonal drier systems, and then at the extreme you had deserts. And so broadly, climate seemed to control these vegetation patterns. But Whittaker worked from his knowledge of vegetation, so he knew what formations were found in places and tried to understand them in terms of climates. And he recognized that there seemed to be a broad zone that wasn't quite wet enough to be a rainforest, but was wetter than a desert, that it wasn't obvious from these two climate variables alone to predict what vegetation was found there. There seemed to be something else going on. And about 10 years ago, the South African ecologist William Bond looked at this question, again, of these ecosystems uncertain. And there's a small area of that climate space, but he plotted that area out in geographical space and showed that quite a large part of the biologically interesting parts of the land surface were in this ecosystem uncertain category, where they didn't seem to be simply described purely from climate characteristics alone. And what he proposed is that what climate tends to do is determine for many systems so if you have a productivity variable that's linked to rainfall and temperature, it can describe the potential vegetation in many systems, and in very low productivity systems like deserts or very high productivity systems like rainforests, it ends up describing the vegetation there. But in many cases, that high productivity system, the high biomass system, the forest essentially, is inhibited by a variety of consumers, things that destroy the potential for trees to grow up there, either at juvenile stage as saplings or as mature adults, and they knock down the vegetation into alternative states that are equally biodiverse and valuable in many ways, but they're not these climate-controlled systems. And what are these consumers? So a large part of them tends to be large animals. They can be browsers. Elephants in particular as tree destroyers in many systems of mature trees, as well as juveniles, but other large animals as well. They can be grazers, which tend to browse grass down, inhibit saplings and juvenile trees from colonizing an area. Or there's also a very important non-biological consumer, which is fire, which William Bond and others emphasize is very much part of the natural processes of the Earth system as a consumer of biomass. And there's often an interplay between the animal consumers and fire consumers that is a function of nutrients and climate and many other factors. A number of experiments. This is an experiment in South Africa where it shows this effect where if you exclude herbivores from a system, you have a very different ecosystem emerging, much more woody, and very different, possibly much more vulnerable to fire with all that intense increase in biomass. And if you plot, much of this work has been done in Africa, because Africa is the continent where large animals still, in many areas, still proliferate at near potential maximum abundances. So a lot of this work's been done there. And if you plot the density of consumption in terms of fire and herbivory along this rainfall, you see that in drier systems, animal herbivory tends to dominate, where you don't get enough fuel building up for fires to spread and proliferate. There simply isn't enough moisture to build up the fuel loads in terms of productivity. But in wetter systems, fire tends to become more important because the fuel loads build up. But this is under current patterns of herbivory. And if you look at past higher densities of animals in many of these systems, you actually had a much more animal herbivory dominated system throughout the entire system. So animals played a major role in shaping these ecosystems. As they declined in abundance in many systems, fire has become increasingly important as a compensating herbivore, but the two play off against each other in shaping these ecosystems. And if you look at the proportion of dry matter that's consumed, you see animal herbivory dominates at low rainfalls, and fire herbivory dominates at higher rainfalls. So if we look at this image of the Earth again, we see that, yes, climate does end up being an important factor in the broad patterns, but many of these areas that we see here are being shaped by large animal and fire interactions playing off each other in shaping the distribution of vegetation. And that also ends up having fundamental Earth system consequences, because that shapes the amount of water cycling through these systems, the amount of sunlight that is reflected back to space by falling on a dry, grassy savanna as opposed to a wet, green rainforest. All of these interactions end up shaping global biogeochemical and Earth system processes. When I wrote my abstract, I ambitiously thought I'd mention the important role that small animals also play. But as I proceeded in preparing this, I realized that it's enough to talk about the big animals and the role they play here. So I'm just putting in a slide or two as a token of appreciation for you invertebrate experts out there, that small animals are incredibly important in ecosystems in many ways. An obvious one is pollination. There are many other processes, but decomposition and the recycling of nutrients. Termites play a huge role, and some of the work that we're doing with colleagues in Africa is exploring the effects of excluding termites or excluding ants from ecosystems and how that changes the functioning and cycling of nutrients in those systems. So this is just a planting a flag of recognizing the importance of the small, but in this limited hour, I'm going to focus on the role that large animals play in ecosystem function. And what I'm hoping to do here is, everybody here likes large animals. They're charismatic, they get a lot of attention for conservation, and we often justify that as conservationists in terms of their value as flagship species or umbrella species, that if you can protect the elephant or the lion, a lot of other parts of that ecosystem get protected in the process. But what I'm going to try and present to you in this talk are some of the other arguments for preserving large animals, some of the functional arguments in how they shape the biogeochemistry, the resilience of ecosystems to environmental change. There's more to large animals than their charisma alone. They're not just passive recipients of the bounties that the ecosystems provide, they're actual shapers of those ecosystems. And they matter because they change habitat structure. Compared to smaller animals, they eat lots, and they keep the food in their gut longer, so as food travels further across the landscape. They move large distances, and also, in many cases, both in the past and in the present, they're often the first major components of an ecosystem to disappear under anthropogenic pressure. So the ecosystem is often perturbed quite early on by the loss or absence of the large animals. So I've talked a bit about herbivores and the role they play. What about large predators? How important are they in the functioning of ecosystems? In the last decade or two, there's been an increasing interest and awareness of the science of trophic cascades. And this book that came out a few years ago by John Terberg and James Estes was particularly influential in raising wider ecological awareness and understanding of case studies of these cascades. And a trophic cascade is when you have this trophic web of interactions between vegetation, herbivores, and various predators, when you disturb the system, when you take one component out of the system, that can have consequences and abundances and activity that cascade through the entire ecosystem. So if you take wolves out of Yellowstone, you have an increased abundance of elk, but also a change in the behavior of the elk as they're less afraid of instant predation. And that can have an effect on the browsing of woody vegetation, and that leads to a change in vegetation structure. And that's one very well-known example, but there are many other examples emerging in the literature, whether terrestrial or marine or vertebrate or invertebrate, of these cascades. When you remove one part of that link in the system, those consequences cascade through in many ways that affect the basic functionality of that system. So this classic example I mentioned is from Yellowstone, where, and this is the work that Bill Ripple and others did in the early 2000s, where they noted that if you looked at the floodplain meadows in Yellowstone National Park, when the wolves were reintroduced, they seemed to flip from a largely tree-free state into a much more densely vegetated state. And here's some of the data showing this pattern over time. As wolves increased in abundance, you see a decline in elk populations and also in elk behavior, and a decline in browsing, and you see an increase over time in regeneration of key tree species such as the cottonwood and the willow. So the basic structure of the vegetation was being affected by the presence of wolves or the absence of wolves. And so in many ways, this is one example, the predators are actually building the vegetation structure, not consciously, but inadvertently through their effect on the prey. They can shape the structure of the ecosystem. And this is one studied system. It's still a bit controversial. Others argue that there isn't such strong evidence that the elk behavior is that changed by the presence of wolves. But as part of a wider library of case studies that are emerging of these trophic cascades and how important they are in ecosystems, there's a very strong case for the importance that predators play in shaping vegetation structure and function. You can see similar examples in marine systems. There's an example of two islands where Jarvis Island, which is unfished, and you have otherwise very similar two systems, where you have an active coral, very productive coral reef, and on an active fishery where the large fish have been fished out, and you have an increase in abundance of smaller, medium-sized fish, and that's shifting the competitive balance between algae and corals, and changing the coral reef structure and making it much more of an algal system. So again, the presence of the top predators is shaping the basic functionality of the system. Another example, one of the fascinating things is that it doesn't seem to require the predators to actually hunt down the prey in large numbers. It's shifting in the behavior of the prey that seems to be the most important factor. This generation of landscapes of fear, and the importance of fear as an ecological and, in fact, as a biogeochemical process at landscape scale is something that's increasingly emerging as a field within ecology. So this is Zion Valley in Utah. It's a beautiful landscape. And this is an area where we find mountain lions, cougars, and they're not actively being persecuted or hunted out, but this is a heavily visited area in some parts of the landscape, and the cougars are beginning to avoid some areas because there's too many tourists, too many visitors there. So their behavior is changing purely in response to human presence, not in terms of human direct persecution. And what studies have shown is areas where the cougars are common. As in Yellowstone, you have a rich riverside community of vegetation. And in areas where the cougars are rare, you have much higher deer populations by the riversides, and the riverside vegetation is heavily browsed. That knocks back the vegetation, and that changes the sediment flow and the basic biogeochemistry of the river. So in this case, I still find it quite astonishing. Clearly, the humans aren't directly doing anything negative to the animals deliberately. They're just simply being there, and that is shifting the entire biogeochemistry of, and sedimentology of the entire valley system, simply through visible of humans watching passively that system. So it's an incredible example of how psychology can feed through into behavior and feed through into ecology. So when we look at landscapes like this, it is an interesting question to ask how much of that structure and vegetation is not shaped by abiotic processes such as rainfall or nutrient supply, but is shaped by more subtle processes such as behavior and fear and the distribution of those processes across the landscape. So what I've shown with a few of these examples is how there are many examples now where you can have alternative stable states where ecosystems can flip from one state, it could be that coral reef system, for example, to another state, that algal-dominated system, by the extirpation of some keystone species, a few species being knocked out, and it could be further enhanced. The barriers between flipping states can be reduced by habitat destruction and direct alteration of that system. And you can see this flipping in many cases of ecosystems there, from an animal-rich state in functioning to an impoverished state in the absence of those animals. And many of the examples I've given you so far have been from Africa, not all of them. And there's one reason for that, particularly in terms of herbivores. If you look at herbivore diversity and abundance, Africa always shines out as the megafaunal continent where the large animals exist and dominate. So how relevant are the insights that we are getting from Africa to the functioning of this relatively herbivore-poor, mega-herbivore-poor wider planet? What can we learn from Africa when the abundances are so unusually high compared to other places? Well, one important realization is that it wasn't always the case. That until approximately 10,000 years ago, depends where you are, the world was filled with large creatures almost everywhere. That African levels of density that we now associate with the Serengeti were found in Europe, in North America, in South America, that we lived on a planet of giants. And a couple of years ago, we had a conference to look at the impacts of the loss of these giants on ecosystem function. And last year, we had this special issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that synthesized some of the findings that we found from that conference. So if you want to delve further into some of the science base behind what I'm talking about, I'd recommend you go into the synthesis paper in here or the specific papers that follow that synthesis paper. And it's important to realize, firstly, how recent this was. In the public imagination, the mammoth is somehow confounded with the dinosaur as big creatures that were there and fierce and there in the past somewhere, in the distant past, far on timescales irrelevant for contemporary human issues. But the mammoths were abundant and around, say, in North America, only 10,000, 12,000 years ago. That's 5 or 6 times the age of London. Twice the age of the pyramids. So these large animals stare back at us just from the edge of human recorded history. We see them in the cave paintings in France and Spain and around the world. They're there in early human consciousness, but they disappeared just on an ecological timescale, a blink of an eye ago. They were everywhere. So in black, we've got where we still find large numbers of large animals, Southern Asia and Africa mainly. But in many other parts of the world, we found an abundance and a richness of species. Sometimes in the case of South America or in Australia, extraordinary creatures that are unlike anything that is around today. But they have gone. And in particular, there were, in the late Pleistocene, there were around 15 species of elephants around the planet. 3 species in South America, Ostegomastodon and Gomphothere, mammoths and mastodons in North America, and a variety of species all across Eurasia. So it really was, with the exception of Australia and Antarctica, in many ways, it really was a planet of the elephants in terms of not only their abundance, but the way that they were shaping ecosystems in the way that African elephants still do today. And if you look at the fauna of South America, around 15,000 years ago, again, a blink of an eye in ecological timescales, In color are the fauna that we still find today in South America. We associate Amazonia with this rich fauna, this diversity, this rainforest that is so full of high biodiversity of wildlife. These are the fauna that we would have found in South America around 15,000 years ago. Extraordinary things like the giant ground sloth, the stegomastodon, the toxodon, the saber-toothed cat, the short-faced bear, an amazing diversity of animals. So this was a scene, what a scene in southern Brazil would have looked like around 15,000 years ago. A similar, if you go in Europe, we have the glacials and the interglacials that confuse things a bit, but if you go back to the last glacial around 100,000 years ago, we'd have seen an abundance of animals in Europe, a straight-tusked elephant, a variety of rhinoceroses. And often when these are found, for example, we find hippopotamus or lions are found in Trafalgar Square in London, the remains of them. It's somehow assumed, oh, the climate was more tropical implicitly or warmer. But actually, it had nothing to do with it being tropical. It was the fact that these megafauna were everywhere at that time, independent of whether it was a temperate or a tropical climate. And if you look at the proportion of these large animals that went extinct in different regions, you see that Africa, since the late Pleistocene, has lost relatively few, on the order of 10%. Australia lost 70%. South America lost the most, around 70% of its large animals. But the Americas generally did very, very poorly. But even Britain lost around 2/3 of the animals that would occur here in a normal interglacial conditions. And so what caused all this? This can be sometimes a subject of controversy. If you look at the Pacific area, in Europe, it was a long and drawn-out extinction, so there's discussion about what's the relative role of climate versus human influence, the emergence of humans out of Africa into Europe. In North America, it coincided with rapid climate change as the ice sheet melted and humans spilled into North America. And so there are intense debates that have got quite heated in many cases about these origins. But from my perspective, I am quite convinced by this global perspective of when you look at when modern humans arrived in different parts of the world and when extinctions of the megafauna occurred, it's pretty much a smoking gun. That on the big picture, when humans arrive, you see the large animals disappear on a timescale of a few thousand years. And that occurred in Australia around 45,000 years ago, in the Americas around 14 to 13,000, in the Caribbean much later, because humans didn't get to the Caribbean until 4,000 years ago, and in Madagascar and New Zealand more recently than that. So if you look at these processes over time, the arrival of humans and the occurrence of major extinctions, there's quite a strong correlation. So what this suggests is that some of the most profound human impacts on the fauna of the planet occurred even before the dawn of agriculture. As Paleolithic hunters, humans were changing and shaping, extirpating large animals, and through some of the processes that I've described and more that I've described, that cascaded through into changing the nature and functioning of ecosystems. And some of those legacies still persist with us today at a global scale. So if you look again, so this is a work by Jens Svenning and others, where they look at what the current diversity of herbivores, mega herbivores greater than 1,000 kilograms, large herbivores between 45 and 1,000 kilograms, and large carnivores, what it is now, and what it would have been now if the late Pleistocene extinctions hadn't taken place. So if those animals had come back into the post-glacial conditions and expanded their ranges as they did in other interglacials. And so you see, again, quite large differences between the two. These could have been quite unfriendly places. Africa now has one very large carnivore, the lion. North America had 9 large carnivores, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears, lions, all competing for prey. So the intensity of predation pressure would have made it quite a challenging place for any first human arrival in that scape. So these were quite ferocious landscapes in many cases. And this process of contraction, as we know, is continuing. So even Africa as the megafaunal continent, and it's an open question why Africa managed to avoid these extinctions. Was it because the species there co-evolved with humans gradually as humans became more sophisticated in their hunting techniques and therefore learned to avoid this predator through behavioral change over time, which didn't occur in this more blitzkrieg arrival in other continents. But even in Africa now, you see a large contraction of ranges going on throughout the last few hundred years. So even where animals are not extinct, in terms of functionality at continental scale, that functionality is disappearing. That connectivity where animals could be ranging over a continent and shifting the functioning of that continent is no longer possible in a human-dominated landscape. And so one feature of this process of defaunation is that over the last tens of thousands of years until the present, there's been an ecological shrinkage in the mean faunal abundance on the planet. So we still have lots of species, so extinction is occurring, but it occurs at a much lower rate. But in terms of animal activity in the landscape and how they're shaping landscapes, there's been an ecological shrinkage over time. So in the case of South America, 10,000 years ago, we lost the gomphotheres. So one of the most significant large animals now is the tapir. But there are many places they're being overhunted and extirpated as well. And we're moving down into 10-kilogram mammals being the most significant mammals. So there's this ecological shrinkage going on in ecosystem functioning. And what happens when animals are taken out is you can have a variety of shifts in controls. So in a normal, complete ecosystem, you can have the largest size of top predator, and often there are larger herbivores that are so large that they escape heavy predation pressure. So elephants are occasionally taken out by lions, but not that often. So this ecosystem with a complete structure the elephants tend to have a strong role in shaping the structure of that ecosystem. If the elephants are lost, but the predators are still there, then it becomes a predation control system, where the predators playing a key role. If you lose both of them, you go to, say, something like a medium-sized herbivore control system. Again, so the control can flip depending on the relative abundance of the largest herbivores or the largest carnivores. And as you go down that process of ecological shrinkage, you can have the repeated flipping from one state to the other. So in the case of Britain, where we've lost all our significant predators, in many cases we often have a deer-dominated system with no strong predation pressure there. That's causing effects on vegetation in terms of limiting forest regeneration. So if we look at what fraction of the mammal biomass on Earth is now left in wild animals, those wild animals are here as green squares. So this dark blue is human animal biomass. So simply our own biomass on the planet dominates that of all wild mammals by a large degree. But if you also include our associated domesticates, cattle and sheep and goats and pigs, you see that human-associated animals are now overwhelmingly a large proportion of mammal biomass, and therefore ecological processes associated with mammals on large parts of the planet. Other roles that I'll mention extend beyond the herbivory and the predation roles. One key role that animals play is through seed dispersal. And that matters in moving species away from their mother trees, so that, for example, so that they have a higher chance of success and a lower risk of pathogens. But we find many fruits now that have no obvious disperser in the natural system. And one of the most classic ones is the avocado, which has this nice hard nut inside of quite a large size. There's nothing around in Central America or Southern America that can really disperse the avocado naturally. So the wild avocado is quite diminished in range. And it seems very well adapted to dispersal by a number of large animals, but in particular, the giant sloth was probably the key dispersal agent of the avocado. So next time you enjoy your guacamole, think of the fact that it's a process of coevolution with this magnificent extinct giant sloth that produced that avocado. In the 70s, this was this awareness of these anachronisms, these fruit that didn't seem to have any natural disperser now that exists in the past. And this awareness was raised by Dan Jansen and Paul Martin, and they term these terms anachronisms, the fruits that don't seem to be dispersed now, but were dispersed quite extensively in the past by co-adaptation with these extinct animals. And this can have ecosystem consequences beyond the immediate species, because many large-seeded trees in particular tend to have higher wood density. They tend to have structures that form larger biomass structures. So if you lose the large-seeded species from an ecosystem, you tend to decrease the biomass of that ecosystem, change the composition of that ecosystem to lower wood density species, lower carbon stocks, lower biomass, and change structure. So there have been a number of simulation studies that have come out recently that show this shift that occurs in structure when you lose and continue to lose animals that are able to disperse the larger seeds. So the final example I'm going to move on to is the role that animals play in shaping the nutrient flow, the biogeochemistry of ecosystems. And I'll start this example by considering the case of the Amazon rainforest. Like many tropical rainforests, notoriously productive, but also largely based on very infertile soils, of very low productivity. So they have very tight internal cycling of nutrients to maintain that productivity. But on the longer time scale, it is an interesting question. Where does the Amazon get its nutrients from? And I'll focus on one particular nutrient, phosphorus, which is important for ecosystems and very limited in old, highly weathered tropical soils. And also it has no easy soluble form, it has no easy airborne form. So there's no easy way of capturing it from water or from the air, unlike nitrogen. So where does the phosphorus that does occur in the Amazon, where does it come from in this old weathered system? Some of it comes in from deposition, Saharan dust blowing across the Atlantic and depositing on Amazonia to some degrees. But the other great source of phosphorus in the Amazon are the Andes Mountains, which are actively weathering. Phosphorus is being deposited in those rivers, being carried as sediment down the floodplain of the Amazon, depositing there. But then the question is, how does it get out of that floodplain into the wider continental ecosystem of Amazonia? And a few years ago, we looked at this and thought, well, what role do animals possibly play in moving nutrients around in landscapes and in ecosystems by consuming vegetation in rich floodplains, going and defecating elsewhere? Plants grow up there with a slightly higher nutrient content. They get consumed, defecated elsewhere. And if you do this over hundreds of generations, you end up having a nutrient pump, possibly, that moves nutrients, diffuses nutrients from nutrient-rich hotspots, such as the floodplain or the Andes slopes, to the wider landscape. So we set out trying to simulate this process of diffusion. Took a lot of data, much of it from Africa, where we have abundant large animal studies, looking at things like population density, metabolic rate, longevity, daily displacement, how much animals move in a day, the home range of animals, the range length. All of these proved to be reasonably good functions of animal mass, approximate functions. There were power laws related to the size. So larger animals ate more, they moved further, food stayed longer in their gut before they defecated. So our large animals were unusually capable of moving nutrients around landscapes. And so then we try to simulate the nutrient supply. Well, if we had, based on what data we could find on likely large animals that were found in Amazonia, and there's some debate over how much they were in the forest or in the savanna. But based on those abundances, we simulated how nutrient distribution in Amazonia might have looked around 15,000 years ago, with this nutrient pump moving nutrients across the landscape away from these red hotspots to a wider level. And then with the megafaunal extinctions, how 15,000 years after these extinctions, how the nutrient supply is now. And you see large areas of blue now, which were green before. So what we argue is that because this animal pump of nutrients has shut down, we're seeing an ongoing decline in nutrient supply in much of Amazonia. And from our model, which needs testing and refining, the process still hasn't reached equilibrium. So what we think we're finding is that the ongoing low levels of nutrient supply in much of the Amazon rainforest are to some extent a legacy of the extinguishing of this animal pump 15,000 years ago. So the consequence of the extinction could still be resounding through many of our ecosystems in ways that are quite unexpected. So if you look at this potential for animals to diffuse nutrients around landscapes, if we map them globally, we see again Africa and bits of southern Asia are the areas where potentially, if the ranges are large enough and they're allowed to roam, there are potentially enough large animals to move these landscapes across. In terms of wild animals playing this role. I'll get on later to the potential role that domesticates may be playing in replacing some of these roles. And so if we look at the landscapes that would have occurred in places such as Europe in the last interglacial, it's possible that there's still many ghosts of these former residents of our ecosystems there in the nutrient biogeochemistry, in the plant defenses against herbivory, in many of the species that we find here. And there could be a number of ways that these lost animals are still shaping our ecosystems and the functioning of our ecosystems. If you go to marine ecosystems, you find similar processes going on, and with large animals such as whales playing an important role. And work by Joe Roman and others have shown that whales are key in marine ecosystems as prey for killer whales, as whale falls that create these unique nutrient-rich ecosystems at the bottom of the ocean, but also as a vertical pump of nutrients. So as whales go down to consume krill or other prey in the deeper ocean, they come up and they defecate in the upper ocean. That can be a pump of nutrients upwards that offsets the gravitational pump that causes most materials slowly to sink over time into the deeper ocean. So here we have an animal-mediated pump that's partially through the process of defecation, but also simply through the sheer mixing that these whales moving up and down through the ocean can do in moving nutrients up through the stratified upper layers of the ocean. Because the upper ocean is warmer than the deeper ocean, this tends to be a thermally stratified area where there is very little natural convective mixing. You need the mechanical mixing that large animals provide to move nutrients up and down to depths of 150 or 200 meters. So, and also whales have lateral migration as well to summer feeding grounds at higher latitudes and winter grounds. And so there can also be a lateral flow of nutrients, much similar to what we find with megafauna on land. And so a few years ago, we got together with Joe Roman, and this is work that was led by my former postdoc, Chris Doughty, who's now at northern Arizona. And so we tried to work out some of the fluxes associated with these nutrients. I've already shown you how we worked on the megafauna on land and working out these fluxes. Working with Joe Roman and others, we tried to quantify the fluxes. Here we're looking at kilograms of phosphorus per year through whales. And then we needed some connectivity between this marine nutrient pump and this land pump. And initially we suggested that seabirds could be playing a role in moving nutrients from oceans to land and try to quantify that flux. And when we had this paper in review, one of the reviewers, John Turbo, pointed out the importance of migratory fish as also quite an important process, and which are now at much lower abundances, so salmon moving upriver and dying upriver as a supply of nutrients. So we also tried to quantify that flux and came up with this overall cycle of nutrients from the deep ocean to the continents. So the natural flow of entropy in an abiotic world is for phosphorus to be weathered on continents, to be deposited in rivers, to be carried out in oceans, and to sink to the ocean floor and to be locked up in bedrock. So what we're proposing with this work is that when you have a world of abundant large animals, they're mixing up those natural processes and diluting them, and in this case, creating potentially a reverse pump that was taking nutrients from the deep ocean to the surface ocean, into rivers and coastal areas, and then across continents through the large animals. So there was this huge animal-dominated biogeochemical pump that reversed the natural abiotic entropy flow of nutrients to the oceans. And that pump now is largely diminished, either through megafaunal extinction or simply through range restriction and great reductions in populations of animals. So we estimated the ocean pump is reduced by about 3/4. The fish pump is reduced by about 96%, and the terrestrial herbivore pump is reduced by around 92%. So this huge process that occurred. So much of our understanding of ecosystem biogeochemistry now is built around an abiotic framework. When we think about why a place is rich in nutrients, we tend to think about depositional environments. Maybe it's bedrock, maybe it's to do with a river floodplain where nutrients deposited. We think of abiotic processes, and our whole field is dominated about that, by that thinking. And what we argue here is that in a world full of large animals, those rules didn't hold anymore. The large animals were just stirring and mixing and making a great confused mess of nutrients across landscapes. That made it a much more complex and a much more biotic process than an abiotic process, which is what it is now. So I'll just conclude by looking into ways, what can we do about that? There's clearly some processes that we can't restore at a global scale. This nutrient pump, it's very hard to imagine the abundances and the connectivity that in a human-dominated world that would enable that global nutrient pump to work at the scale that it did in the past. But even being aware of that pump can help us think about ecosystems. In agricultural systems, we can pump in nutrients and they can make up for this nutrient deficit. But when we're thinking about natural ecosystems and managing them, we may need to be aware that these systems are more nutrient-starved than they've been through much of their ecological history in many cases. So one thing that we can do clearly, and this is a big priority, is halt the loss of large animals where we can and try and reverse that loss. This is an image a few months ago. I was lucky to be in Shishlui in Mfolozi in South Africa, which is at the center of the recovery of the white rhino population. The southern white rhino was down to a few dozen individuals in the 1970s, and now they spread to many thousands all over southern Africa from this source population in Shishlui. And clearly, there's huge poaching pressure now, so the story is still very uncertain in the near future. But this is one of the great successes of the conservation and reversal of the decline of large animals. In the oceans, we're beginning to see some recovery to moderate levels of the populations of large animals such as whales since the whaling moratorium, but still at levels that are much lower than the pre-whaling levels of abundance of these large creatures that occurred. And to some extent, simply being aware of what the baseline is and how we should go back hundreds of years, or in many cases thousands of years, to understand what the capacity for large animals in these ecosystems is, can change our thinking about managing some of these ecosystems. In some areas, we may want to think about what role do our abundant domestic animals play in substituting some of those roles. So if you think about rangelands in Africa, where there's still extensive and largely free-moving nomadic pastoralism, that could be playing a substitution role for nutrient movement in a way that wild animals used to do in the past in those African landscapes. And this is under-recognized, under-studied, but there could be a potential here for thinking about nutrient management and biogeochemical functioning at landscape scale in these human animal systems, such as pastoralist systems. And this is an image of the Allerdale in the Highlands of Scotland. And another thing that's getting of increasing interest is the potential of bringing back some of these animals. We can't do this everywhere on a large scale, but there's some landscapes where it may well be possible to bring some of the large animal functionality back. And we can do that for lots of emotional and charismatic reasons, and there are plenty of strong reasons to do that, but also there may be very good reasons in terms of functioning and resilience of these ecosystems in a world that's changing because of climate change and because of other pressures. And so when you think of the highlands of Scotland, in many cases very heavily grazed by a heavy abundance of deer, how could those highlands change if there were a more complete trophic dynamic system there with predation, with ecologies, with landscapes of fear, with ecologies of fear being built into some of these landscapes? So the arguments around some of these ideas around rewilding or restoration are by bringing back key species, we may be able to flip ecosystems from these impoverished states to more rewilded, more dynamic ecosystem, more unpredictable ecosystems. There's not a clear management focus in that same way. They may be more unpredictable. And the process of ecological restoration can also help in assisting that process. In many parts of Europe, which are more interconnected than this island is, many large animals are also reappearing through a natural comeback, through rural abandonment of agricultural land. So that provides an opportunity to think about some of these questions in the context of large herbivores and large predators. And there are a number of these rewilding projects at smaller scales, are very, very focused on particular questions, appearing in a variety of spots around the UK. One key organization is this work is exploring this functionality of large animals, is Rewilding Europe. That's trying to expand the range of key species, such as the European bison in key reserves across Europe, and also trying to rebuild some of these lost animals. So one iconic species is the auroch, the ancestor of the domestic cattle that went extinct around the 1600s. But many of the genetic components of the auroch are found in certain breeds of cattle, some of the older breeds of cattle. And so they're trying to breed back something that's similar to the auroch in terms of its structure and its functionality through the Tauros program. So to conclude, the key point I was trying to get across in my talk today is that big wildlife is great for lots of reasons. They're charismatic, they're flagship species, but they're more than just charismatic. And a lot of the emerging work coming out from ecosystem ecology is arguing that they play or did play an integral role in the functioning of many ecosystems. And we're only just beginning to understand some of those roles. So there's a lot that's happened in the last 5-10 years. A lot of these are more hypotheses than established observational bits of science, but the ideas are floating out there on how the nutrient cycling, the vegetation structure of ecosystems is shaped by these large animals, and that those ideas need to be tested and explored further. And we're beginning to understand some of the long-term consequences of their loss that span on for centuries or possibly millennia after the loss of these large animals. And we need to explore how these roles can either be substituted for or replenished at the scale of landscapes and at the scale of the global biosphere. So just a few thank yous for various colleagues who've contributed to this work, and thank you.